Hello, First United Methodist Church of Sterling. This is the fifth lesson in our study of James this summer together, and we're going to be talking this time about two aspects. First of all, the content that we'll be focused on in chapter 3, verses 1 through 12 is speech. That's the dominating idea here. What does it look like to be a wise person who controls your speech and speaks well and faithfully. But we're also going to talk about a background issue, as we've been doing each time, one background issue, and that's the Hellenism or the Greek influence of James in the book. So that's what we're doing this week, and we're right at the midpoint of our study this summer. We've had 4 weeks already. We have 4 weeks to go, so this one is the midpoint in the summer study of James. Last week, what we talked about is James 2:14 through 26, which is probably the most famous passage within James that talks about works being necessary and not faith alone. What my view is that in this section, what James is contending is that works is necessary to demonstrate faith, and how I understand that to mean is, and I think this part is pretty clear, faith is mere intellectual agreement. It's just kind of saying, yes, I agree with those doctrines, I agree with those belief structures, I believe that there's one God, or something like that, but not doing anything more than just kind of intellectually saying, yep, that's probably true. And I think that part's pretty clear. Some of the other aspects are a little bit more debated, but I do think works for James are pretty clearly moral deeds that you do. The part that's probably the most debated, I guess, is that when he talks about justifying, I think that's confirming faith or showing faith to be an action, rather than actually bringing about righteousness. It's more that it confirms a righteousness that's already there, and that part could be debated maybe. But in any case, the point is, it's not enough simply to intellectually say, yes, I agree with this set of doctrines, and therefore you're saved or justified before God. On some basic level, you have to do something. You have to react. You have to entrust yourself to God, and live a different life is necessary to be saved. From a Protestant perspective, I think that the living the different life is showing what's already happened, but there's a sense of entrusting yourself to God that is the saving faith, and that's more than just an intellectual belief. This comes up because James and Paul sounds they're different, and especially Protestant Christians, which the Methodist Church would be part of, tend to really listen to Paul on this matter, and talk about being saved by faith alone and so forth. Despite the fact that they contradict each other, I do think James and Paul are complementary, that they can work together. They're emphasizing different aspects of things. Paul's emphasizing the initial faith commitment. James is saying, well, if it's a true faith commitment, something's going to flow from that. But I think the two can work together. And we talked about, since they do sound like they contradict each other, how do we understand that? And I think it's possible that they just use the same terms in different ways and do so independently, that they're not aware of each other's wording. For my point, though, I think it makes sense to me that James is correcting misunderstanding of Paul. And so when James is correcting those who say faith is enough, what he's saying, well, but not that type of faith. That's not the kind of faith that Paul meant. And the faith you're talking about is not enough. You need to have the kind of faith that Paul talks about, which does imply a certain level of action. So that's what we talked about last week. If you are interested in that, you can go back and watch the video from last week. But let's talk about the Hellenism of James. And to put this into context, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Jewishness of James, how early on, certainly in the first century, to be a Jew was certainly not in contradiction from being a Christian. We tend to think of these two different religions, and you would be a Jew or a Christian. But at that point, all the early Christians were Jewish, thought of themselves as Jewish, and religiously would have looked very Jewish as well. So much so that James talks about going to synagogue in the book of James. It doesn't usually translate that, but in James 2:2, it talks about your meeting place is your synagogue. So this is probably a Christian synagogue of Jews worshiping Jesus. So, Jew and Christian, James is both. It's a Jewish Christian document. But we also talked about how the Jewishness of James, or that's what we talked about earlier, but another point I want to make is that sometimes I think if you know something about the ancient world, you might think at least, that some Jews who were very proud of their Jewish heritage very much rejected Hellenistic influence in Greek culture and all those sorts of things. And if that is your impression, it's not necessarily the case. Some very good Jews who very much cared about their religious background and the temple and following kosher food laws and all those sorts of things were also some of those that were the most able in Greek literature and in Greek culture and knew a lot about Greek culture. And so very often good Jews, it was not just lapsed Jews or something like that who were participating in Greek culture. Good Jews participated in much of ancient Greek culture. So we're going to this week talk about how James is not only Jewish, but also very Hellenistic document. So with that, I'm going to give a very brief history of Greeks and Jews. You might know some of this, you might not, but I think it helps to give a little bit of background. And even though this is a church setting, I'm a professor, so it kind of makes sense that I just give a little bit of sort of the intellectual backdrop for the matter. But if you know something about Greek history, you know that there were these massive Hellenistic or Greek empires in the ancient world that started in the 4th century, late 4th century, the 300s, and lasted until the 1st century BC, going for a very long period and covering a lot of the world. And those start, of course, with Alexander the Great, who reigned as king of Macedonia, starting in 332, kind of got all the Greek kingdoms together, and then went on a massive campaign in 10 years, defeating the Persian Empire, which had been reigning for 200 years, and was a massive empire itself. Takes over Persia, takes over a few other regions as well, but Persia is the big one. And all of a sudden, Alexander the Great is the ruler of this massive empire. He contracts a disease, doesn't have any sons, and dies. This is, by the way, after a lot of the famous Greek writers from Athens, like Plato and Socrates. It's just a little bit after Plato, Socrates, and Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And even earlier would be people like Homer. So all of those have already happened by the time Alexander the Great comes through. But he dies, has no kids, and so his empire divides among his various generals, and there end up being two major empires that exist for this entire time from the 4th century to the 1st century. And the first one is the Ptolemies. The P is silent. So the Ptolemies, they're out of Alexandria in Egypt, and they ruled the Jewish people for the most part from 323, as soon as Alexander dies. This is part of the territory the Ptolemies take over until 198. So for the longest period of time, the Jewish people are sort of reporting to Egypt and this Greek empire out of Egypt. By the way, Cleopatra later on in the 1st century BC is a Ptolemaic queen. So she's really Greek, not Egyptian specifically. And then the other major one, which had an even larger territory, are the Seleucids, and they end up ruling the Jewish people for only a short period of time, from 198 to 164. They're out of Syria and Antioch, but their empire spread all the way to India and Pakistan, and it was a massive empire. And these two kingdoms ruled, and for the most part, under the Ptolemies, the Jewish people were fine with them and their rule. The Seleucids, the earliest ones, were fine, but there became a king by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which is a mouthful, but he was a very bad king from the Seleucid kingdom and tried to enforce all these anti-Jewish measures against Jerusalem, mostly out of spite, but maybe to unify his kingdom in Hellenism. And because of what he did, he polluted the temple, sacrificed a pig on the altar, which is very, very unclean, and dedicated the Jerusalem temple to Zeus. And all of these caused guerrilla warfare and a rebellion among the Jewish people, which is, if you know anything about 1st and 2nd Maccabees, what we're talking about with 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and it's the background for the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, which is rededication. So in 164, the Jewish people, it's kind of a series of times, but in 164 is the first step. The Jewish people under a family known as the Maccabees drive out the Seleucid Greek kingdom and slowly gain control over Jerusalem and Judea, and then expand out to much of modern-day Israel. And that's how the Greek rule ends in and around Jerusalem, with the Jewish people having about a century of independence until 63 BC when the Romans take over. But all of this results in this interplay of Hellenism and Judaism. On some measures, to be Greek was to reject your Jewish heritage, but on most things, many of the people who were the most religiously devoted could also adopt a lot of Greek culture. But certainly with these hundreds of years of being under Greek rule, it soaks into the entire ancient world, but certainly the Jewish people as well. And so there's this interplay of both Jewish faith and Hellenistic culture at the time. At time there's conflict. So the three major things that Jewish people typically react negatively against in Greek culture are deities, both in the sense that they're worshiping multiple gods that they see as false gods, Zeus, Athena, and others. Jupiter would be the Latin god, Poseidon, and so forth. So they rejected that, but also worshiping using idols, using images. Jewish people disagreed with both. Another common thing that you see among Jewish people who live among Greeks is that they thought the Greeks' sexual mores were wildly off, and the Greeks were honestly quite disgusting. I mean, anyone in our modern culture would be disgusted by some of the things the Greek people did. So they often rejected that. And then the final thing is that the distinctive Jewish practices like eating kosher would sometimes make the Jewish people suspect from a Greek point of view, because the Jewish people would sort of eat together and not eat with Greeks, in many cases at least, and that made them seem sort of standoffish to others. So those typically were the three areas that you see some disagreement between Greek culture and Judaism. But on the other hand, there's a lot of synthesis, and the biggest one is just the Greek language becomes the language of all Jewish people living outside of Palestine or modern-day state of Israel. Any Jewish person living in the rest of the Roman world, including in Rome itself, is not speaking Latin. They're speaking Greek. So the Greek language predominates, and that's why the New Testament is in Greek. But we also see a certain level of philosophy. Some of the Platonic philosophy starts kind of coming into Jewish thought. A lot of ethics from the Stoics in particular. There's a lot of similarities between certain aspects of Christian teaching you see in the New Testament and other Jewish teaching at the time that actually is very similar to Stoic views on a number of matters. So we see some kind of synthesis there. And just in general, a number of points of culture. And we see this in the New Testament with Paul as well, that he'll talk about different games and, races and things like that. That's very much out of Greek culture. The Olympic Games and everything are a Greek invention. So a lot of this cultural stuff is also coming in, and it's not, a bad thing for Jewish people that they were adopting certain aspects of Greek culture. And we see this in James as well. So just a few Hellenistic touches in the book of James that we see coming through. First and foremost is what really is accomplished, playful Greek. There are puns that are happening, memorable images from nature and culture, and so forth that happen throughout James. In terms of polished Greek in the New Testament, the best is Hebrews. There are parts of Luke and Acts that are very nice as well. Sometimes Paul is good, although Paul often just seems to kind of think a little bit too quickly or something, and so it's not always the most polished, although it's solid Greek as well. But James is probably, I would say, on the whole, second to Hebrews as the best Greek in the New Testament, despite the fact that we think of it as a very Jewish Christian document. It's also great Greek document as well. And in terms of memorable images from nature and culture, this is part of the reason I decided to talk about Hellenism with this chapter, but there are all sorts of references to nature and to inventions within the world, rudders on ships, and talking about bits in the mouths of horses, things that have been tamed, kind of images from nature, all of those sorts of things. This is, like it's pretty good vocabulary that we're seeing here in chapter 3 itself, going on. But the other thing in terms of like puns and some playfulness, I think might be best illustrated by going a chapter back into chapter 2. So we see in James 2, 20 through 23, I'm using the NRSV because I think it brings out the Greek the best in this particular place. But even there, I've adapted it a little bit because we often sort of, in English translation, it takes out some of the puns that are going on. But I've highlighted here in blue, though it's coming up in blue now, this pun on the Greek word work, or erga, ergon, I guess, in the singular, but erga as works, and some of the adjectives and verbs, and everything in blue is a Greek word. And so we see that there's this pun that happens again and again: works, unworking, works, was working along with, his works, was filled out by works. You see that there's this kind of pun happening on the idea of works throughout this place, throughout this passage in James. So it's kind of, fun, Greek, playful, using the same kind of root word in various different ways to make his point. And I also think there's kind of a secondary pun going on. This isn't as definitive, but literally, do you want to be shown? It usually says you fool or something, but it literally is you empty person. And then you see later, his faith was filled out by his works, and that scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God. So I think there's also this kind of pun on emptiness and fullness that's happening in the same passage. So if this is correct, then James has kind of two different puns he's working with in just this short paragraph. So you get a sense of the playfulness of his Greek and how focused he is, and what he can accomplish with his Greek. A second thing is that it's a really great example of Hellenistic Jewish wisdom. He's not the only example. There are actually lots of Hellenistic Jewish writers. Philo of Alexandria. There's a book called Wisdom of Solomon. There's also another book called Sirach or Ben Sira, and others, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. There are a number of works that are written by Jewish people who are very much focused on Greek culture. Fourth Maccabees would be another example. That also very much use Greek philosophy and wisdom and things like that. We see that in James. It certainly is indebted to Old Testament wisdom, like the book of Proverbs, in many of different places. But there are some places where it also fits in very well with Greek moral philosophy. And I just picked one example from this passage. There are a number of little things that you can find throughout James that fit the moral thinking of the day, and especially for the most part Stoic philosophers. But the example I'm going to give is from Plato and a connection to Plato. So in James 3, we see him talk about the tongue as kind of controlling the body when the mind really should be controlling the self. And he uses the example of trying to control yourself with being either a bit in the mouth of a horse, or else like a ship's pilot that's leading a ship along by this very small element and everything. So we see talking about that analogy in James 3, 2 through 4, how a bit turns the whole horse, or a ship is turned by this rudder, and that's a way to talk about how the tongue is now kind of taking control of the body, when in theory it should be the mind and the will kind of exercising control over the full body. And this really fits an analogy that Plato had used back in the Phaedrus in 360 BC, where he talks about the soul being something like a pilot or a charioteer who has two horses and has bits in the mouths of the two horses. In this character, or in this analogy that Plato is developing, the charioteer is reason, And the two horses, one of them is noble and one of them is ignoble. The noble one is the heaven-directed desires that we have, and the ignoble one is the sort of earth-directed desires that we have. And these two horses are sort of out of control, and reason is trying to bring them into control. And so he's using the same analogy of like the moral life and exercising control over yourself is like putting bits in the mouths of horses and being a chariot driver. That's a lot similar to what James is saying as well, using a similar analogy. And also there's, the sense of the fact that our desires are just naturally a little bit out of control, and we have to work to bring them into control. So we see that in James, and there are a lot of similar small examples like this that you could find throughout James that he seems maybe not have to have read Plato or something like that, but he seems at least generally aware of kind of ways of conceiving of the moral life in popular philosophy. And there's at least a possible knowledge of a technical Greek term in chapter 3, verse 6. Depending on translation, it might say something else like the course of one's life, but literally it's the wheel of becoming is what the word here is. And that was at least used in certain sort of mystical philosophical schools for talking about how fate controls the destiny of a life, and within some of those schools they believed in reincarnation, and so it was kind of the movement from one life to the next. James certainly isn't using it in this technical sense, but even knowing the phrase, some have thought it wasn't really well known that it was a pretty technical term and only known by a few people. It's not really clear if it was not known by a lot of people, but at least some have seen this as evidence that James has some real knowledge of Greek writings, because it is not a super common phrase. So in a lot of different ways, we see that James is very focused on Hellenistic culture and is a good Hellenistic document, as well as being very Jewish. And this makes me think, if James is indeed James, the brother of Jesus, which is probably the best guess, but is not guaranteed. But if it is, then that raises an interesting question to me. How Hellenized would that mean Jesus is? How knowledgeable of Greek culture would Jesus have been? I usually think of Jesus as kind of far less than Paul or somebody knowing Greek culture and sort of focused on just living his life within Palestine and everything. But if this James really is the brother of Jesus and knows some of Greek culture and is very accomplished in Greek, was Jesus able to speak in Greek? Was Jesus knowledgeable about at least some Greek philosophy and everything? I think it's possible, and that would be an interesting implication of this take here. So anyway, that's some of the Hellenistic background of James, and I should, before this video gets along too far, begin to talk about speech, which is what we'll really focus on when we gather this coming Sunday together. This is the kind of content focus of James here. So the theme of speech here begins in chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, and this is probably the starting point, and the most practical application in terms of people who need to learn from this is teachers. So James says that if you're a teacher, thinking of teachers within the church, though certainly I, as a professor, take this to heart and really think about this as I teach as well. You have to be really careful because you'll be judged more strictly. And then it talks about how maturity or perfection, I think mature is probably the better way to translate what many translations give as perfect here. But it takes maturity to require before you can control the tongue, and we need to be in control of our tongues if we're going to be a mature person. And so he starts by saying, especially those who make their living by speaking, you have to be careful in how you use your tongue. Then he gives a lot of examples of what the tongue out of control means. If we don't have control of our tongue, then the tongue has control of our lives. And he gives various examples in verses 3 through 6 from life. All of them are examples of small things that affect big things. So a bit in the mouth of a horse turns the horse. A ship is turned by a little rudder. A forest can be set aflame by a small spark. All of those sorts of things are examples of very small things that affect big things, just like the tongue, if it's out of control, affects our entire lives. And then He makes this more specific by talking about the fact that we've tamed all these animals in world history. Even at his time, they had tamed a lot of animals, all the more so for us. But we are not able to tame our own tongues. And so that just is so ironic that we can tame different animals and everything, elephants and whatnot, but we cannot tame this small little thing within our mouths. And then he takes it to what probably is the speech infraction that he's most worried about. So the type of people he's most worried about are teachers, but the particular infraction that seems to be driving him more than any we see in verses 9 through 12, and it's when we honor God and dishonor others, and he thinks we should both honor God and others. And so he says we cannot praise God and curse anyone. We are not allowed to curse anyone, because all people are made in God's image. So even if somebody is living a bad life and doing wrong things, we can critique them maybe on certain levels, but we are never allowed to think of them as sort of beyond God's, help or redemption. We cannot curse anyone because everyone is made in God's image, and even if they're living their lives in not good ways, they still deserve that respect of being made in God's image no matter what. And so that is what James is saying here in verses 9 and 10. And then he gives some images to sort of hammer home how impossible this is. A spring that produces both fresh and salt water, a fig tree bearing olives, or a grapevine bearing figs, all these sorts of things. Who you are at your core is going to be what you bring forth. And so if we're bringing forth bad speech, that means there's a problem in our core, is James's point here. So we need to control our tongues. So some takeaways and questions. First of all, religiously faithful people can adopt elements of culture. James adopts elements of Hellenistic culture, and that's fine, and it's not compromising his faith to do so. But obviously the main one for this passage, watch your speech, particularly for teachers, and particularly regarding what you say about other people. Those are, I think, very important things to do. In general, you should watch your speech, but if you make your living by talking, be extra careful, and be particularly careful about what you say of other people. Some questions to consider that we'll consider together on Sunday. First of all, what elements of American culture can we adopt, and sort of implicitly, what shouldn't we adopt as well, but maybe focusing more positively, what are parts of American culture that are good that we can adopt? Second, just related to the tongue aspect, what struggles or successes have you had with taming the tongue? Why is it so important to do? Another question to consider for Sunday. And I like to give a little bit beforehand some things to think about for the following week if you're getting ahead. So for next week, so this is not this coming Sunday, but the following one, the passage we'll be reading is the rest of James 3 going into James 4, verse 12. And a couple questions you can consider is, have you ever known someone who had the attributes described in 3:17 and 18? And what do you think it means to be a friend of the world versus a friend of God? Chapter 4, verse 4 talks about that. So do you think we have to reject society to be a friend of God or not? Is that what James is saying here? A couple things that you can consider for next week. But for this Sunday, we're going to be talking about speech in James 3, 1 through 12, and I look forward to our conversation together.